July 10, 2015, the Confederate flag, which had flown on the State House grounds of my home state of South Carolina since the early 60s, originally atop the Capitol building, was lowered for the last time. The flag, which had been a source of debate and disagreement for decades, was finally taken down after the outcry over its place on the grounds had intensified due to the recent act of terror against an African American congregation just over 100 miles away in Charleston. The church had played an important role in a slave rebellion in the early 19th century. It was burned to the ground after the incident, only to be rebuilt years later. In 1962, Martin Luther King Jr. spoke at the church, the same year that the Confederate flag was placed on the grounds in Columbia. Evidence later released made it clear that the young killer, a native of the Columbia area, identified strongly with the battle flag of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, which has become, among other things, a symbol of white power. He also sported other flags that belonged to regimes associated with colonialization and apartheid. It seemed to be clear to many in the American public that symbols, while not wholly responsible for the tragedy in Charleston, were nonetheless a factor. The place of such symbols on our government's grounds and our society at large was brought into question. Many defended the flag's historical significance, while others cited its history of being utilized by hate groups both in the U.S. and abroad. After much argument, the flag was finally lowered. 20 days later, at Martin Luther King National Historical Site in Atlanta, Georgia, police received a report of 2 suspects placing Confederate flags around the grounds. Clearly, the battle of symbols in our culture would continue. Which begs the question, what was Martin Luther King Jr.'s relationship with symbols? How did he utilize them, and how did he acknowledge them? Dr. King rarely spoke out directly about symbols. A rare occasion was the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycotts, when he challenged the threat of jail, saying this: "Up to the time of Christ, the cross was a symbol of crime. But since that time, it has become a symbol of victory, faith, and love." The Montgomery County Jail has taken on different meaning now for Black people. It is a symbol portraying a struggle for justice, a fight for rights. King understood that to challenge a corrupt system, one must also challenge the symbols that it employs. A prison record is often used to decry one's character, but Dr. King inverted this idea and turned jail time into a badge of honor when it was the result of wrongful arrests or peaceful protests. As a preacher firmly embedded in the Protestant tradition, King placed a greater emphasis on words than images. However, as one of the most powerful orators in our nation's history, he often used his words to paint pictures that would become seared into the public consciousness. In doing so, he not only enacted his inheritance from the Reformers, but also embodied the role of the Old Testament prophet, whose language he often borrowed.
"One day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together." No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
But he also utilized symbols such as that of the moral arc of the universe, which he borrowed from a 19th century abolitionist minister.
How long? Not long. Because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice.
And he painted symbolic pictures with his own words about the sons of former slaves and former slave owners, which would fuel a symbolic vision of the future of equality that Dr. King hoped and worked for.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
It's worth noting that one clear exception to Dr. King's use of symbols is actually found in his most famous speech, which took place in one of the most symbolically rich locations in the United States. As a proponent for the power of art and symbols, I wonder if this speech would be essential to the American identity if it had taken place anywhere else. However, it was not just King's words that carried a symbolic weight, but also his actions, and the actions that he inspired in others. The marches across the southern United States and peaceful protests in places opposed to the message of the civil rights movement were highly symbolic acts. Often these actions took participants to places weighted with cultural significance that would challenge the meaning of such a place and sometimes redefine it, as seen in the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge during the Selma campaign. Because of the time in which King lived, one of burgeoning news media outlets and the growing influence of the television set in American homes, these symbols were readily accessible to millions of people on a daily basis. It seems like King recognized this, and it's questionable whether or not the civil rights movement would have had as much success if it had taken place before the advent of television. In the Selma March, King and other civil rights leaders purposefully placed protesters in a situation of potential danger. This was all part of his goal not to create a crisis, but to expose the one that he already insisted exists. The images of suffering were hard for the American public to ignore. The veil over so many eyes was lifted. King and the other leaders purposefully chose places where they would face great opposition from white government officials so that such images would be possible, so that injustice could no longer be ignored but exposed and, hopefully, expunged. Just like the arrest of Rosa Parks, the willingness of people to peacefully suffer for their cause became a rallying point, and it changed the way that many white citizens viewed their African American counterparts. Rosa Parks had not been the first person of color arrested for not giving up her seat to a white passenger, but her age, her lack of a record, and her poise throughout the entire ordeal made her the perfect poster woman for the movement. And it was this arrest that would draw a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. into the civil rights fight. In my study of leadership, it is clear to me that King was a masterful symbolic leader, telling stories like those of Parks and countless others fighting for civil rights, creating images with his words, and inspiring a larger culture to envision a different kind of world. As a result of his influence, King himself became somewhat of a symbol. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize and named Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1963. After his assassination in 1968, his status as a symbol only grew. The United States has established a federal holiday for King, the only such holiday to honor the life of an individual United States citizen, though its adoption was not without contention or political maneuvering in certain states. Today, most major cities in the United States have a road named after Dr. King, and his childhood home, church, and burial site are all preserved as part of a National Historical Site. Of course, the problem of symbols, as we have seen with the Confederate flag, is that they are often reduced to something simple when they, in fact, represent larger, complex realities. Is it possible that Dr. King's legacy has been simplified to fit an easy mold? Author Richard Lentz examines the way that King was written about in magazines throughout his career and argues that King's symbolic status changed throughout his life, since King himself at first preached the gospel of American idealism, only to be later seen as a radical who symbolically turned on the society who honored him. Lentz shows, like author James Cone, that King was viewed as a rational force for change over and against more radical leaders like Malcolm X, a fact that the latter used in King's favor by visiting Selma and utilizing his own symbolic status to make King's efforts look more favorable. But the fact is that King's own status as a symbol moved to a more radical position over time, even as Malcolm X had begun to drift away from the far edges of his former rhetoric. Could it be that by turning King into a symbol of a fight also considered all but won, we have filed off his rough edges, given ourselves license to ignore his hard words about poverty, American exceptionalism, or the unjust violence perpetrated by our nation across the world? It seems undeniable that King's understanding of the problem of racism in our nation was complicated by his time in the North and also by the war in Vietnam. Yet even in his growing radicalism, King's vision of the future remained one of unity and equality. He was wary of the growing Black Power movement, and though he understood the word's origins and the need for the self-worth that they affirmed, he nonetheless did not affirm the use of the slogan, writing, "Why not use the slogan Black consciousness or Black equality?" These phrases would be less vulnerable and would more accurately describe what we are about. The words black and power together give the impression that we are talking about black domination rather than black equality. In this discourse, we clearly see how much King cared about the symbolic power and weight of words and phrases. Perhaps here is where we get our answer to how King would address an issue like the Confederate flag or other sticky issues dealing with symbols. While he knew that the words black power were not used by all to assert black domination, he was also aware of how the phrase could be interpreted by white counterparts, and was therefore cautious of using it for the sake of others. Perhaps Christians who see the Confederate flag as only a symbol of pride in the southeastern United States could and should imitate King in this way, not ignoring their own feelings or understandings of the flag, but acknowledging that not everyone sees this symbol the way that they do. We continue to live in a world of symbols, and the fight for their place in our society will also continue. Symbols have and always will play an important role in our culture. Dr. King also lived in a world of symbols, and though he rarely used images to get across his message, he nonetheless gave breath to a symbolic vision of the future. Will our culture be defined by King's vision or by some other force? Only time will tell, but I believe that King would opt for hope over fear. King's final public address was no less symbolically packed than any of the other sermons and talks throughout his ministry. In it, he seems to acknowledge his own symbolic significance by speaking of himself as a sort of Moses figure. But he also chooses to downplay his own role in favor of a more potent symbolic concept, the Promised Land.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the Promised Land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the Promised Land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming